All right. Good evening, everybody. Tuesday evening, so thanks for everyone for coming out and making your way to the University of Sydney Law School. And my name is Cole Kirkby, if you don't know me, and I'm the director of the Julius Stone Institute of Jurisprudence. And on behalf of the Institute and the University of Sydney Law School, I'm pleased to welcome you to this year's Julius Stone Address. And I want to start by acknowledging that this evening's lecture is taking place on the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I want to pay my respects to their families and elders. And I also want to acknowledge that they never ceded their sovereignty or their lands and recognize their ongoing struggles for justice. And I also want to make a number of thanks for the funders of this event and the Julius Stone Institute more generally. And I'd like to start with the Educational Heritage Fund and thank them for funding this Julius Stone Address. And the Julius Stone Institute of Jurisprudence, for those who don't know, was established in 1999 and seeks to contribute to scholarship and legal theory in that broad sense of the term that Julius Stone understood it and practiced it. And the Institute organizes regular seminars, workshops, conferences, other events, which a number of people, including our speaker tonight, have been a part of in the past. And the Institute also supports research in legal theory and does so in a number of ways, one of which is the Rika Stone PhD scholarship. And this year we have two significant new positions. The first is a Julius Stone Visiting Professorial Fellow, which was held by Damiano Canali, Professor of Philosophy of Law and Critical Thinking at Bocconi University in Milan. And the second is a Julius Stone Postdoctoral Fellowship, held now by Dr. Mayeria Rum, recently of New York University. So both these fellowships, again, are generously funded, these ones by the Sir Zelman Cohen Universities Fund. Now, if that weren't enough, every 5 years, the Institute also awards the Dennis Leslie Mahoney Prize in Legal Theory, an award of $50,000. And none of these activities would be possible, again, without the general support of Dennis Mahoney and other friends and family of Julius Stone, some of who are joining us tonight. So my institute is the Institute is grateful to them all, and I'd like to extend my special thanks again to the members of the Stone family in attendance tonight, who we'll hear from later on after the lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge that the vice-regal couple are in attendance this evening, and so extend my welcome to Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beasley, Companion of the Order of Australia, King's Counsel, Governor of the State of New South Wales in the Commonwealth of Australia, and to Mr. Dennis Wilson. So now my thanks out of the way, I want to introduce our speaker tonight. And I'm delighted that this year's address will be delivered by Professor Leah Eppie. Professor Eppie is one of the world's leading political philosophers, as well as a prominent public intellectual. She's professor in political theory at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and an honorary professor in philosophy at the Australian National University. A native of Albania, she has degrees in philosophy and in literature from the University of Rome, La Sapienza, a PhD from the European University Institute, and was a postdoctoral prize research fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford University. She's also author of a number of books, so I'm just going to, Global Justice and Avantgarde Political Agency, The Meaning of Partisanship with Jonathan White, and The Architectonic of Reason. And her latest book, a philosophical memoir entitled Free, Coming of Age at the End of History, won the 2002 Royal Society of Literature Ondaatje Prize and Slightly Fox First Biography Prize, and is being translated into more than 20 languages. And her academic work has been recognized with the British Academy Prize for Excellence in Political Science and the Leverhulme Prize for Outstanding Research Achievement. So please join me in welcoming Professor Eppie and her address tonight. What is political progress?
Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for being here. It's a great pleasure and an honor to give this lecture. The title of the lecture is What is Political Progress? And the topic of the lecture is Progress. which is both necessary and a dangerous idea. It's a dangerous idea because narratives around progress and the importance of defending progress have often given rise to instances of paternalism, colonial domination, and civilizational superiority. And it's also necessary if one is trying to improve the way things are, and that's because we need an account of how our efforts to combat the injustices that we face in our daily lives come together to form a kind of meaningful whole that doesn't just disappear at the end of our lives, but is integrated in something that is larger and bigger than just our limited existence. So what I'm going to try and do tonight is to defend an account of progress that in some ways incorporates the standard objections to narratives of progress that are problematic and that have given rise to these problematic institutions that we have just discussed and described and that we also just heard in the acknowledgement of country, but to also defend the idea of progress, and in particular the idea of political progress, and to try and illustrate how that more critical account of political progress might look like. And what I'm going to suggest is that we make political progress not when we try to arrive at an ideal that is already pre-constituted and given to us and that we know about, but when the institutions and the steps that we take in that direction learn from the mistakes that we have made in the past. And so I'm going to try over the course of the lecture to articulate what that more critical account of progress might look like and what does it mean to learn from the trials and failures of the past. And to outline how those learning processes might take place, I will defend the idea that there is a core to justice and that the basic function of justice is to regulate the coercive use of power, and further to explain that we should understand progress in the norms of justice as a result of cumulative processes of development of different views of how power ought to be regulated, exercised, and how it's justified to those on whom it's exercised. But before that, I want to start with two simple and obvious questions. So the first one is, what does it mean to say that we must believe in progress? What does this kind of postulate of the importance of progress mean? And to answer that question, it might help to locate the epistemic status of progress in terms of a kind of propositional attitude that is between two extreme kinds of belief. So on the one hand is to say that progress is important and we have to defend progress, is to say that progress is not impossible. And that sounds plausible, but it's also very trivial, because the position that progress is not impossible seems to gain the strength from the weakness of its alternative, which is to say that progress is impossible. And that alternative account is weak because it commits us to a form of dogmatic belief around the implausibility of progress that seems just as unconvincing as the strength of the position that we were trying to defend, which is that progress is there and it's important. And that's because to say that progress is impossible, whenever we say that, we commit ourselves to a kind of prophetic theorizing that claims to know what the future will look like. And that's also what the alternative does, which is to claim that progress is necessary. So that's the second extreme. On the one hand, we want to say a little bit more than just progress is possible or progress is not impossible. On the other hand, at the other extreme, there is the belief that progress is necessary. And that's too strong. In arguing that case, one seems to misunderstand the nature of the agent on whose behalf we're making claims around progress. And to put that argument in more philosophical terms, it also seems to commit us to a kind of prophetic theorizing about the future. And that prophetic theorizing seems to only be justified if the prophet who makes claims on progress and what the future will look like actually makes the events that they are prophesying about. And so we can only make those claims around that agent and around that prophet who is foreseeing its own future if we could ascribe to that agent always good intentions and good moral beliefs and predict that the world will turn out compatibly to those moral beliefs and to that moral agency, When, however, we know that human beings aren't exclusively moral. Their motives are always mixed, and there is evil in their action. They often act out of self-interested maxims. They don't always act out of these moral imperatives that they believe in. And so it's very difficult to know in advance what to expect from actions such as those and from circumstances such as those. So I want to locate the position that I'm trying to take in this paper in between, or in this lecture, between these two different kinds of beliefs. On the one hand, we want to say more than progress is not impossible. On the other hand, we want to say less than progress is necessary. And here I want to scrutinize and defend the idea that to answer the problem on whether that belief that is situated between these two other extreme beliefs is warranted, what we need is a kind of shift in perspective. And what we need to do is to focus on the moral agency on human beings as it expresses itself in the course of human history by examining the kinds of social and political institutions that human beings promote and create in the way in which they promote or hinder that moral agency. So we need to explore history from a philosophical perspective as if we were looking at a normatively purposeful and normatively integrated system that puts together moral motives, practical actions, and contingent events. So here I want to focus on this specificity of political progress and to try and articulate how I think of that conception of progress that is situated between these two beliefs, and that conception of progress as something that is unpacked in history, but in a history that we look at from a critical perspective in a way that tries to learn from the failures of previous ways of looking at history from that philosophical perspective. So it's an effort to recover these kinds of old-fashioned ideas around how to think about history philosophically on the one hand, but to recover them without their tainted past and without all the narratives of civilizational superiority and paternalism and domination that they seem to have traditionally given rise to. So that idea that human beings might make progress, don't necessarily, but we can't also rule it out, might make progress in the course of attempting to solve the problems that are presented to them as they make claims in human history, is actually one that is relatively familiar in the philosophical literature around the idea of moral progress, and in particular the philosophically pragmatist literature. And my position in this paper on political progress is in some ways connected to that philosophically pragmatic account of looking at morality, but rather than focusing on moral progress, as many philosophical pragmatists do, I want to focus on the specificities of political progress, and to also, as I explain how I think about political progress, try and explain the difference between moral progress on the one hand and political progress on the other, and try and explain what is it that makes political progress a distinctive question compared to moral progress. So I try to think about the similarities and the differences between moral and political progress, and to articulate, as I'll go on to explain, an account of political progress that is centered on the evolution of justice-based norms. And I will say in a minute why I think justice is the central concept. And then to explain what kind of criteria we might deploy as we try to articulate this account of justice as progress that learns from the failures and the mistakes and the successes of the past. And so how we might articulate what I will call progressive political transition. So what makes the difference? How do we distinguish between a progressive political transition and a regressive or a status quo-oriented political transition? And then I'll say something towards the end of the paper on some objections that this account seems to attract, and we can go on to discuss that further. So let me start with the idea of moral progress and explain the differences between moral and political progress. So one way to make sense of moral progress and political progress is to appeal to teleological assumptions that invoke the progressive march of human history, and that's often the caricature way in which people, when they criticize philosophies of history or when they criticize moral agency expressed through history, that's what they have in mind, is this almost automatic march of this grand history with a big capital H that moves forward as the small histories of individuals and particular perspectives are left behind and often ignored. And that is exactly what seems to have given rise historically to this dangerous narrative that I have just been describing. Another perspective, which is the one that I think is the more plausible one, is to think about progress as a process of functional refinement of norms. So let me say something about functionality and why I think that account is more promising. Function statements are familiar in, for example, evolutionary biology, when we discuss the development of a particular organ in terms of its contribution to the performance of a particular function. And so we say things like human beings have hearts so that they can pump blood. Function there is described as a property or a set of properties that explains the existence and the preservation of particular traits in a species and explains that preservation via evolutionary mechanisms. So a lot of authors have tried to extend this account from the philosophy of biology, philosophy of science into moral philosophy by thinking about morality as a form of social technology. And although I don't particularly like the term, the idea is there to also account for the function of morality as something that is subject to functional refinement. And on that account, on this familiar philosophical pragmatic account around the development of moral norms, the function of ethics is to remedy altruism failures. And so a body of moral norms is, in that literature, considered progressive if it contributes to the process of functional refinement of codes of conduct that help remedy these altruism failures in a way that is solid across temporal and cultural variations. I'm only saying this because it's the background for thinking about functions, functionality, functional refinement, functional properties, but I'm not going to say a lot more about that because some of the objections are common and I don't have time in this paper to go into the details of the meta-ethical background of that analysis. My aim in the lecture is the more limited one of trying to account for political progress as something that is related to moral progress but also distinctive. And in particular, to explore the progressive or regressive potential of political norms and their application to the political realm. So I'm just going to assume, and we can discuss this later, the general plausibility of function statements, the application of function statements to ethics, and the way in which typically moral philosophers make sense of that application to moral norms, and the plausibility of identifying the basic function of ethics with the remedying of altruism failures. And one might say there's different moral theories that account for how exactly you remedy altruism failures. What I'm more specifically concerned with in this lecture is how moral and political norms relate to each other if we assume the general plausibility of this account of functional statements as they apply to problem solving. And that's because we're usually accustomed to thinking of political theory as a distinctive realm from moral philosophy. Although it's related, it's distinctive in the following way, in that we assume in political theory that although individuals might have as individuals or as individual moral agents succeeded in coming up with codes of conduct that enable them to have morality and to relate to each other in a moral way, there are issues that still plague them in their relationship to each other as political agents in the political realm. And so there's something about the political and the way in which we interact with each other in the political sphere that seems to be distinctive and to raise distinctive concerns compared to how it raises concerns when it's a question of interpersonal morality and interpersonal relations. And that's because even, as I say, if we assume that people have managed to overcome their altruism failures by having these basic moral inclinations and by having a body of norms that allows them to overcome issues of envy and selfishness and uncooperative behavior, there are two further questions that are specific to the political realm. The first one has to do with the lack of assurance. So the fact that even if one follows moral prescriptions, even if one does the right thing, one can't assume that everyone else will do the same. And so we can call this the problem of coordination. The second problem is that even if we coordinate, even if we acquire a body of moral norms, and even if we assume that we can somehow interact with each other and coordinate with each other at a particular time, we are not guaranteed that that will continue over time. And so even if we find the body of moral norms, even if we apply those norms while we're there, there is something about continuity that is also distinctive. So the question is both how we coordinate, but also how we preserve the benefits of coordination across time. And again, I'm going to call this the problem of continuity. Now, there's a familiar story that political philosophers tell from these two basic problems of politics. And that story runs from across the kind of canon of Western political thought, at least, from Plato to Machiavelli, from Hobbes to Rousseau, from Kant to Hegel to Rawls. And that is that political institutions that exercise some form of collective authority are necessary if we want to solve these two problems, the problem of coordination and the problem of continuity. And further, they say, or political theory tells us, that this form of collective authority is effective if it can condition human development of human practices through a combination of punishing sanctions and rules disciplining their actions. And so this is what we might call for short power. So we are, again, in the history of political philosophy, constantly confronted with this question of the exercise of power as something that comes out of coordinated political authority, as something that is in turn necessary to overcome the limits of altruistic dispositions and norms, even if we concede that these altruistic dispositions and norms are essential to recognize the need for power. And it's important to emphasize this because there are a number of political theorists who think that the political realm is distinctive in that it raises completely different questions from moral philosophy. And I don't want to take that standpoint. I want to say that political theory, political philosophy is in continuity with moral philosophy, but it is distinctive in that it raises this distinctive question of the relationship between power, authority, and how you create institutions that enable us to solve these two problems of coordination and continuity. So the generation and replication of political power through different kinds of institutions is different from the generation and replication of moral norms through voluntary efforts. And in that sense, the political is distinctive. So if we think about political progress as a kind of progress that is captured by the functional refinement of altruistic dispositions, it has to be about this distinctive property, about this distinctive thing that we do to each other when we relate to each other in the political realm, which is the exercise of power. So, and so, as I say, the idea of functional refinement of moral norms makes sense in its relationship to political philosophy if we think about the specific property that we need to think about functional refinement. I'll carry on and I'll be louder and louder, right? So, okay, so in the next thing I want to do is to try and give some more specific remarks of how we can be a bit more, how we can go into the more details of this account and to explain how we can conceptualize this notion of learning from the failures of the past in this politically distinctive perspective. So we talked about the importance of sanctions, and we talked and we talked about the discipline and about authority and about the fact that we create these collective institutions that are required to improve on coordination and continuity. And the next concept that's very important, that has been important in the history of political thought, and indeed at the heart of law, is the concept of justice. And we're told justice is the first virtue of social institutions, whether that has always been the case or whether it's become prominent in the way in which we understand ourselves as modern societies, or it's historically contingent, how it generates and how it relates to different values, isn't really crucial for our purposes. What matters is that justice is important because norms of justice are what helps us articulate how we relate to power and how we use power in relating to each other. So justice helps us reflect on the way in which power should be regulated, allowing us to ask questions around who exercises power, with what tools, through what discourses, through what means, and how do they generate that exercise, and how do they reproduce that exercise of power. So norms of justice seem to play in the political realm a kind of equivalent role to that of moral norms in the interpersonal realm. Moral norms help us understand how we ought to relate to each other. Justice norms help us understand how we relate to each other in a context where authority is there and where the exercise of power is required, and a discourse around what are the basic justificatory tools that we give and that we have to explain how power is exercised is there in order to create and to maintain political control through power replicating mechanisms. So if the function of ethics is to remedy altruism failures, the function of justice might be to regulate the way in which collective authorities exercise power in the presence of conflicts that have to do with these two basic questions of the political, the problem of coordination and the problem of continuity. So again, that is to say that in the course of cooperating to solve political problems, human beings come up with principles and with schemes that enable them to understand and to reflect and to articulate how power is exercised, with what reasons, on whom, and with what criticisms also of that reason, and to also come up with schemes of conduct that are more or less adequate in responding to the different social conflicts that they face. Now, the nature of the problems will be different at different points in time, but it's plausible to assume that people will, in the course of struggling with social conflict, in the course of trying to solve these problems, come up with these different interpretations, and that these different interpretations will be able to be morally assessed and assessed with regard to particular criteria. And that is where the progressive discourse, the discussion around the progressive refinement of norms of justice becomes important. So what does it mean to say, if we give this narrative, this historical narrative around how power generates justice-based norms, how justice-based norms are connected to particular justificatory narratives around power, what does it mean to say that justice-based norms are subject to functional refinement in the way in which moral norms, or in a way that is similar to how moral norms might be functional, as we said, to moral development and to the functional refinement? So one way of answering that question might be to think about the process of developing justice-based norms as the process of discovery of appropriate political and institutional responses to the concerns and the commitments of the people that are subject to power and subject to the norms of justice. And we don't need to think about this process as one that is driven by reason-giving from the start. And I'm going to unpack a bit more of this in the second half of the paper. And we also don't have to think of it as a linear progress that never gets destroyed. So we don't have to assume that once we come up with an appropriate scheme, that scheme is always there and remains and is kind of robust across time. The emergence of different principles of justice and the different schemes on the basis of which political authority might be justified historically has been determined by a range of factors. So sometimes it's a kind of brutal imposition of a coercive system of rules on the side of powerful elites. Sometimes it's the successful abolition of a previously exploitative system as a result of instances of resistance by those who were subject to these unjust norms or dissatisfied social groups. Sometimes it's the kind of peaceful establishment of a social ethos that habituates people increasingly to progress and to what it means to accept certain rules and to accept certain norms of justice. And sometimes it's a combination of intellectual work, political struggle, and concessions made by elites, so a combination of all these three things. So the genealogy of different forms of rule is different, but the point of reflecting on political progress as a process of refinement of these justice-based norms is that we can think about this genealogy and deploy it critically when we reflect on existing forms of rule, and therefore when we reflect on how we can learn and what we can learn from the past in resolving the conflicts that we face in the present. And that's where the narrative around progress becomes really important, because it enables us to connect the struggles of the present with the struggles of the past and to think about schemes that have made sense and that have been more or less conducive to the refinement of justice. So how can we do that? How can we track progress? One way is to think, as I said, about the way in which political institutions respond to the concerns and to the commitments of the subjects on which they exercise power. And we can reflect on that, and we can kind of reflect on the progress that we make in that trajectory by deploying a kind of Valibilist method. So this method is a way of, which I've developed borrowing and thinking about philosophy of science and the way in which fallibility criteria are deployed in philosophy of science, is by thinking about three different ways of making sense of progress, and by using these three different criteria that I will now introduce, which I call a diagnostic criteria, an innovating criterion, and a heuristic criterion. So the first one is what scheme of justice enables us to capture and to track functional differentiation and functional refinement of the norms of justice. The first criterion is to say it's the scheme of justice that has a better diagnostic capacity compared to other schemes of justice. So if you have a different family of views, or a view or an interpretation of how power ought to be exercised on whom and through what means, and so we have an interpretation of the function of justice as it's connected to power, my argument is that one family of views will be superior to its rival alternatives if it identifies the grounds and the scope of the conflict that it's trying to resolve at an appropriately fundamental level. I'm going to give an example in a minute, but just to give you the kind of general abstract way of thinking about this. So diagnosis is really important. There is a social conflict. We're trying to think about what are the grounds, what are the roots of this conflict, how can we resolve the conflict, how can we produce norms of justice that enable us to tackle this conflict. One criterion is to say that works if we have diagnosed the conflict in the right way, if we know what the causes are, if we know what the sources of injustice and grievance are. The second one is an innovating criteria, because the argument is that a theory or a family of theories of justice innovates compared to alternatives if it's able to identify the principles on behalf of whom power will be exercised in a way that preserves the normative benefits of its alternatives but avoids the pitfalls. And that's what it means to learn from the past, is to be able to make use of theories of justice that can, as I say, that can innovate over alternatives in the sense that they can preserve their benefits, so don't constitute retracements, they don't go back, but they enable them to resolve a new problem and to preserve the benefits, as I say. And the third one is that a theory or a family of theories has heuristic potential when it's a combination of, when this particular combination of innovating principles on the one hand and diagnostic potential on the other captures also guidelines for anticipating new problems that weren't able to be foreseen at that point, up to that point. So if in any particular context of the justification of basic norms, we can identify principles that allow these functions to be discharged by reflecting on the structure of social roles and their relationship to power and the connection to the grievances of the different agents in society, we can observe the challenges to the system and the kinds of conflicts that we grapple with an eye to which particular interpretations of these conflicts enable us to orient ourselves in this way with the use of these three criteria, and which ones don't have that potential. So that helps us understand, I hope, from a kind of methodological perspective, how particular social and political institutions basically always have a normative function. We can examine the adequacy of these political and social institutions and the normative function that they discharge by thinking about the different interpretations and the different theories that are used in discharging those basic functions. And we can then assess the challenges that they encounter and the new conflicts that they give rise to, and whether they are appropriate to address these conflicts or not. So I'm going to make this example now, this theory and these criteria a little bit, hopefully a bit more concrete, by just giving you an example from my work and the debate on global justice. It's actually been going on in political theory for a few decades now, where the central question is how a particular property, namely justice, is reflected in the different interpretation of the function and the purpose of the political institutions that try to realize that property. And in the context of that debate, you have two rival theories. So you have, say, an egalitarian theory of justice and a sufficientarian theory of justice. So egalitarian theory says the problem of global justice is the problem of people not having as much as other people in different parts of the world. So there is a fundamental problem with inequality, with global inequality, that we need to tackle with. And the background justification for that is the importance of combating relative deprivation as much as absolute deprivation when thinking about the failures of globalization and poverty and so on. And on the other hand, you have a different theory, which is a sufficientarian theory, which says, no, the problem is not that people don't have as much as other people, but they don't have enough. And so everybody needs to have enough in the world, and then the world will resolve. So in asking which of these two interpretations perform better, we need to think about, okay, how do they diagnose globalization? How do they think about the causes of conflict at a global level, the causes of injustice, the causes of material poverty, and so on? And and you think about what's called the circumstances of global injustice on a global scale, the agents that are affected by these conflicts, the kinds of claims that they make on global institutions, and the way in which we go about constructing an assessment of these different theories is by comparing how each of them diagnoses. And so sufficientarian theory will typically reduce everything to contributions by the state. The egalitarian theory will reduce everything to interactions within global world, and so global international institutions and so on. We think about which of them innovates, so which of them can preserve the benefits of alternatives while creating new principles that enable us to capture these new conflicts at the global level, and then how they can also have what I call heuristic predictive capacity in coming up with new challenges that then these new institutions will face and so on. Okay, so one question might be, so that's kind of example to give you a sense of how I use and how I think about different theories of justice in capturing existing conflicts and in thinking about globalization from this particular perspective. So one might think, why do we exactly focus on justice as the most appropriate concept whose functional refinement ought to be investigated? And I think the reason we select justice as the relevant property and the kind of lack of justice as the problem to be solved is not that we have an ideal that justice trumps every other value and that we need to prioritize justice just because. I think the relationship is here dialectical. So on the one hand, we focus on justice because that is the kind of claim that agents make now on the global scope when they think about emancipation. They demand justice. And that is because that's a result itself of a learning process through which human beings have historically discovered a conceptual framework that enables them to make claims on each other and to reflect on the use of power by giving reasons for action that refer to these concepts of justice and to the idea of rights and a rights order, rights-based order, and so on. So justice on that account is a functional response to a background problem. And normative properties on this account, again, are problem-driven. They don't come out of a commitment to a Platonic ideal of a value that we select and we think is important just because compared to all others. They retain their relevance for as long as they contribute to improve certain functions and form the basis on which we seek then to guide and to further reflect and refine them. And although the functional refinement of norms is historically generated, it's itself part of a cumulative process that tends to produce justified beliefs through a reliable process of trial and failure and success. And so again, on this account, truth is understood as something that we approach in the course of making these progressive transitions. A set of beliefs that obtains plausibility in the process of its validation. That's why it's a Valibilist method. A body of thought retains this validity for as long as it's not challenged, and it's not challenged for as long as those who entertain it converge on the importance of continuing to uphold the kinds of claims that constitute these justified sets of beliefs. So this is why a principle or a combination of principles that is desirable is one that appeals to institutions and constructs institutions that perform better than their competitors in tackling and responding to the background concerns and commitments of the agents that are subjected to the power of these institutions. Okay, I'm now going to say briefly a couple of sort of talk about some objections to this account. So I said the interpretation of the function and the purpose of political institutions should be sensitive to the historical process of refinement of these justice-based norms. And my argument is that more these norms are intersubjectively endorsed by agents and reflected in the social and the political institutions that they collectively construct, the more they are justified. And the more they are justified, the greater their contribution to moral and to political progress. And the more progress we make, the closer we are to realizing the ideal, rather than having the ideal that we try to approximate by making progress. Now, one objection that I tend to get when I present this account is that we don't know if a particular practice is progressive unless we know the direction of its movement. And we can only know if a particular direction is right or wrong if we have access to an independent standard that tells us what is right and what is wrong. And so if we want to maintain that political progress is made by correcting the mistakes of the past rather than being able to foresee the future, we have to be able to rely on actual historical practices as making an important contribution carrying forward the functional refinement of norms. But then it looks like if we move in that fallibilistic way, which takes seriously what we learn from history and how we can challenge it, this comes to us with another difficulty. And so the difficulty is that if the historical survival of a moral outlook is sufficient evidence for the plausibility of the norms that underpin it, couldn't that set of norms have prevailed simply out of coercion or out of manipulation or out of ideological distortion of the background picture? And so wouldn't our current beliefs, if history is what we're relying on and the acceptance of norms throughout history is what we're relying on to generate these discussion around functional refinement, wouldn't our current beliefs and practices then just reflect the outcome of a power struggle itself? And so wouldn't that be just basically what one might call the arrogance of the point of view of the present, that thinks that it's actually morally superior to other viewpoints in the past, but actually it's just as much the result of ideological manipulation and coercion and so on? Okay, so that objection, I think, would be valid if we were willing to recognize as valid any criteria on the circumstances under which agents uphold norms of justice. And so if we say, just because someone has accepted this norm, the mere fact of accepting that norm, the sheer presence of consent indicates that the norm is valid and people are just subjecting themselves. But I don't think we need to be that charitable when we're thinking about consent and how consent is formed and what background conditions are for that. And let me just give you an example for that. So one might say, to give you a kind of thought experiment for how we construct, how we think about consent and how we think about the generation of consent through a coercive rule and so on. So think about the function, we just said the function of justice is to justify the coercive use of power by regulating access to the benefits and burdens of social cooperation. The function is served through different social and political arrangements. Now imagine that at some point in history, and it's not imagine, it's also at some point in history, people have given justifications to each other based on birth rank. So this was the norm that was available at the time, thanks to the power and coercive means of those who were belonging to the higher rank, so the masters. People who were belonging to a lower rank, so call them the serfs, would endorse the norms of slavery, the norms of birth rank that that institution generated, and people just seem to consent to the institution. So the serfs might be dissatisfied, but we could stipulate that they don't have alternative epistemic visions available, and they don't have the means to experiment with simply subverting the norms. Now, imagine that at some point there is a crisis, for whatever reason. It can be catastrophe, it can be war, it can be enmity with neighbors. The society of serfs, or a society based on birth rank, is challenged, and a crisis erupts. And people start asking themselves how and with what justifications did they generate the institutions that were trying to resolve the conflicts at the time. So the question is, given alternative institutions that become conceivable, would the next generation of members of that society continue to endorse norms of deference or based on birth rank? Or would the norm continue to be upheld despite the disappearance of these external constraints, so manipulation, ideological? And so the counterfactual experiment is, if this were choice of political institutions was done without the constraints that the previous one had, would the society of serfs still generate norms of slavery, or would it want a society that doesn't have these norms of slavery? And does a society that then overcomes eventually the norms of slavery in its reason giving constitute a progressive transition compared to a society that retains those norms of slavery, or is that a regressive move? And are we able to then compare these two societies both in time and in space and think, well, this society is progressive, this society is regressive, because one of them generates norms that everyone accepts, and the other one generates norms that not everyone accepts and is able to justify. So the kind of counterfactual test places constraints on the conditions on the basis of which we assess these different interpretations of the function and the purpose of different institutions. Okay, let me now think about, so I'm not sure how much time I have. I think I'll go back to talk about a second kind of methodological problem and a second objection, which is that how can we generate prescriptions for the future? Because the way in which I've addressed this objection is by saying we can look at the past and we can think at progressive compared to regressive transitions in the past. And the claim that I want to make in the paper is that we can use these historical narratives of the past to orient ourselves for the future and to try and build some account of problem solving and some account of the functional differentiation of the norms of justice by learning from what we have done in the past and from how these norms were more or less justified in the past. So how can we generate prescriptions? By telling the history of political progress in the past. And since we seem to only be able to have post-factum reconstructions of progressive transitions, but are we able to use these post-factum reconstructions of progressive transitions, so the fight against slavery or colonial domination and so on, are we able to appropriate these narratives and to think about them as narratives that can give us some action guidance for the future? That's the next objection. So I want to go back to this case of global justice that I just mentioned before, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with and that's the one that I've done more work on. And on the account that I defend, what we do is we start by observing challenges to the function and to the purpose of basic institutions that different political agents make in society. So we confront a problem in the present by thinking, okay, what are the claims out there around the society that we have now? So you might think, migration or environmental questions, or what are the different agents in society, what kind of claims are they making on the political institutions that exercise power over them, what kind of reasons are they giving for the acceptability or unacceptability of these institutions. And we try to understand, so we engage with practices. We start with practices and we start with struggles in the present, and we try to think about these practices and what they tell us about the sources of conflict in the first instance. So, and this is what I call a kind of pre-interpretive observation, which is to think about the normative commitments that the different groups in society that make claims on institutions raise, and how these normative commitments connect to normative commitments in the past. So one of them is, think about neo-fascist movements, for example. How do the claims that movements in the present connect to movements that we consider regressive from the way in which they have operated in the past, and how do they relate and reflect on the use of power? So one outcome of that pre-interpretive observation is when we engage with social groups that make claims on society, to rule out those groups as relevant for purposes of normative inquiry, those groups who make claims that seem to appeal to regressive narratives about justice that we know have been defeated in history somehow, that we have learned from history in reflecting on and in assessing. Now, to say that these agents are excluded from normative attention doesn't mean that they have no role to play whatsoever. It just gives us a more narrow scope and a more narrow perspective when we engage with this. Which kind of agents do we now need to engage with when we think about innovating stage? And I call this, in my first book, I called these agents avant-garde agents because that was the best term I could find, not because they were necessarily avant-garde in how they were articulating their concerns and commitments, but because these are the agents out there that are alerting us to injustices that are normatively salient. And one of the things that we can learn from this account of progress is that not all struggles for injustice are normatively salient, and not all concerns about society and the society that we live in are ones that we should be worried by from a moral perspective. So, and as I say, which of these agents are the agents that are kind of moral importance depends on the balance of their claims in a normative account that is dependent on political practice at the diagnostic stage, so when we're thinking about which conflicts are relevant, but not necessarily right when we're thinking about how we formulate principles that is able to take us forward and move forward from the present to the future. And once appropriate principles are necessary to remedy the defects in existing political institutions, we can then further restrict the domain of application of these principles by then thinking about who can promote these principles further. So they're also avant-garde agents, because once they connect to a particular normative theory and a normative interpretation in the right way, then you have a productive collaboration between theory and practice. So you have principles of justice that are articulated at a wider level, struggles in society that are normatively salient because they articulate principles or they signal to the absence of principles that connect to the past in the right way. And then we have a combination of theory and practice that I think that I call dialectical for want of a better term, but that I think it signals an important and a way of relating to struggles in history that is philosophically oriented because it's informed by normative principles, but hopefully not problematic in the way that previous narratives around philosophical history have been considered to be problematic. So instances of political practice direct our attention to the kinds of problems that need to be solved. Theories are necessary to develop principles that contribute to the functional refinement of the norms underpinning these practices, and then instances of agency and articulation of principles are then combined to change the shape of the social and political institutions and to reflect on these new articulated norms and leading to new developments. So again, this doesn't imply that there is a hierarchical division of labor between theory and practice, and that's why I started by saying this is not an account of progress that starts with an ideal of justice and then says, okay, now how do we realize this ideal? Because the idea is that we reflect and we connect to existing movements in society to articulate the ideals of justice, and where we think about struggles that are salient from a theoretical perspective as given by instances of political practice. So one might say, okay, by taking the history of political progress to help us make normative prescriptions, aren't we committing the kind of old naturalistic fallacy of deriving an ought from an is, and this is the last criticism. And without getting into the kind of details of the controversy around the naturalistic fallacy, I want to just point out that what we're interested in here is how to think about ought more generally. So it's not about deriving, so the concern with the naturalistic fallacy is where you see how things are, and then you derive an ought from the is of the real world, as it were. My question here is with the functional refinements in ought, because every kind of statement about justice is an ought-type statement. So the question here is how do you derive a more articulate ought from a less, from an ought that doesn't seem to respond to the concerns and to the commitments of the agents on which these institutions exercise power in the right way. What matters is to emphasize that regardless of where the first ought comes from, because I think we're kind of past the question of where that first ought comes from, is to think about political progress as the result of the refinement of the function of justice that is engaged in this reflection between different kinds of normative ought-like statements with a different content depending on different historical circumstances. So I'm just going to wrap up. What did I argue? That moral and political progress are centrally important to any account of human agency that is interested in the development of agency through historical and political institutions, but that is also interested in the transformative potential of that development. And I also suggested that it's possible to reflect on moral and political progress from this pragmatic viewpoint that sees the issue of progress in a fallibilist, problem-oriented manner. And what I try to do in the paper is to defend the distinctiveness of political progress compared to moral progress in terms of its functional refinement of the norms of justice. It was very general, inevitably, and very methodologically abstract in some ways, though maybe we can try and make that more specific in Q&A, and I only try to give you one example of how that might have a bearing on this particular debate in political theory that I have been engaged with, which is the global justice debate, but there are a lot of other controversies out there now to which I think the same methodological criteria can be applied, and I think we need many more applications in some ways to corroborate the kinds of claims that I've been making, but I'm hoping that the argument gives some orientation into where an account that tries to revive political progress as this concept that, as I said, is both necessary whilst being aware of the possible dangers of applying it, in what direction we might go in pursuing further the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And so we have time for a fair amount of time for some questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
This is a very primitive question that I think you're likely to have heard 1,000 times before, but I didn't hear, though I thought it was assumed, much about the criteria by which you judge these three levels of diagnosis and innovation. And the easy thing is, which you projected, that we have an ideal and we see how it's gone, and we see, or you have a much richer, in the account you gave, a much richer account of maybe piecemeal social engineering as a technique, or pragmatism as a technique of moving along, and I understand that. But I would like to hear a little more about how do you bring to bear criteria for judging what's a good diagnosis, what's an innovation that preserves.
Thank you. So this is where I was trying to go when I said that for me it's a question of interaction of theory and practice, and it's not, you can't be too specific in either direction, because being too specific in either direction would violate the practice in the direction of the theory, and likewise would kind of give too much priority to certain practices compared to how much normative value they have. My theory is that, and that's why I also don't like the pragmatic normative theorists, moral philosophers. They talk about social engineering all the time, and they talk about ethics, technological ethics, and so on. I don't particularly like that, because my account is much more bottom-up and is kind of ground-up rather than thinking about it as a form of social engineering, actually. It's more about recognizing, in some ways, democracy as the process through which people make claims on each other, but also recognizing that democracy is very flawed, and so that not every democratic movement, not every protest, not every conflict in society actually stands up to normative criteria when you think about the past and when you think about our relationship to the past. So the way I think about it is, as I said, as a kind of combination of theory and practice. There's a intellectual discourse that is sensitive to what goes on in the real world and to the questions that are discussed out there, and so doesn't invent conflicts but tries to engage with the conflicts that there are, and then reflects on what are the different agents that make claim on institutions in these different instances of conflict. So there can be, as I said, many examples: migration, environmental justice, global justice, development, and so on, corruption, all kinds of interpretations of the function and purpose of political institutions out there. And the idea is that theory is sensitive to these instances of conflict in practice, and to people who challenge institutions, who think, I'm not getting my rights, I don't like the way power is being exercised, it's not being done in my name, and so on. And then tries to reflect on these different movements in a way that enables the intellectual discourse to distinguish between these different kinds of movements while listening to all of them in a way. And then the next stage is further help articulate the movements that are singled out as the most normatively salient and more having a kind of moral claim. So it's not a full-blown moral theory that is just applied to the world and says, okay, we have morality, we have justice, we have truth, we know what all of these things are, and all we need to do is just realize them. It's more a question of saying, what have we learned from injustices in the past and from the way in which institutions have developed discourses around justice, including democracy, which is, I think, one way of talking about justice, regime types, and so on, and how can we use what we know from the past and what we have learned from the past in dissecting different movements in the present, and then bringing more clarity to the work of these movements, which is why I call them Avantgarde agency. And the Avantgarde agency is a kind of combination of theory and practice, in then making their claims more sharp and better listened to and better articulated. And that's where then one generates the productive engagement.
Thank you very much. I'm Jessica White from the University of New South Wales. Thanks for a fabulous talk. I wanted to ask you about the point that you made about those regressive movements that subscribe to positions that we've learned not to take seriously, or that we've learned from, in your account of the idea that they could be sort of excluded from normative consideration. And you mentioned fascism, but I wanted to ask you about something that you've devoted a lot of thought to, obviously, which is communism or even socialism. And I wondered about the form of consensus that you seem to be assuming about our view of which movements can be dismissed. I'm sure that in this room here, there's very little consensus about the question of communism. And I wonder where it stands in relation to what you presented there. And in particular, I wondered if you could comment on the way that our answers to that question of which movements can be dismissed or which ones have proven to be regressive might change over time. Answers to that question in relation to communism or to socialism may have looked very different in the mid-1990s to how they look today in the context of rampant inequality and climate crisis. So just some clarification there. Thank you.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So I think, actually, when I think about real-world communism, I think of them as closer to fascism ideologically and in practice than to the to communism as a theory of institutions and of how power should be exercised. So I started by saying we have families of views that all make claims on institutions and all relates institutions to individuals in certain ways. And when I think about communism as that kind of theory, it's a theory about, so first communism, then I'll get to socialism. Communism is a theory about the withering away of the state. It's a theory about not interacting in the presence of coercive institutions. It's about a theory of how law eventually disintegrates under, taken over by society and so on. And when I think about what we call real-world communist governments, that's none of these governments actually exhibited the features of the theory as that kind of theory. Then socialism is the next one, and socialism is also distinctive because when you think again about the practices of these governments, they were much closer to a type of social protectionism, and so very strong presence of the state in the lives of individuals, but also very strong consolidation of the nation state as well. And again, socialist theory is more about the market leading to a certain way of understanding the relationship between democracy and the state, which isn't how these institutions. So that's why I think just from a kind of purely theoretical perspective, if you think of these theories as just theories, then it seems to me that what we have had in history isn't really what the theory is supposed to tell us about these institutions. So they just remain, the ideal. Now, some might say, of course, with fascism, that might also be the case. So they also have ideals, and they didn't really get really institutionalized and materialized in the way in which the ideal was promising. But actually, I think their materialization was much closer, in the case of fascist governments, to the ideal than the case of socialist and communist governments. However, I'm also very sensitive to the objection that says, okay, but now things with this name, things that were called socialism and that were called communism, were actually, for better or worse, appealed to in the governments of these societies. So what should we do with the terms? And that's where I think this narrative of progress is important to try and help us then relate the theory with the practice in the right way, and to try and unpack in the kind of messy reality of these governments and these institutions which of the steps towards justice were progressive steps and which ones were regressive steps, even if we leave aside the question of the label of what they were called. Something similar might also apply to liberalism, which is why some people say you need to invent new terms for the world. And so, but I also, so I think, just to answer your question, there is a difference, I think, in how theory and practice of institutions have matched each other historically in the case of fascist governments compared to communist governments. And I think historically, what the so-called communist governments were actually closer to fascist governments in their regulation than they were to the, at least the theory of communism.
My name is John Keane. Thank you very much, Leah, for a very stimulating talk that aroused in me quite a lot of resistance, I have to say. That's probably the sign of a very good lecture. I want to ask you about why it is that progress, as you're defining it, the refinement of norms of justice, learning from past mistakes, fallibilism, etc., is one form of thinking about time. But I'm very struck by one trend of my lifetime where what's called chronopolitics becomes more complicated. I mean, I think we're living through a period where there's a multiplication of different forms of time, different rhythms. Think about the geologist deep time, which has become, there are many millions of people aware of this. It's a different rhythm than you've just described. Or think of the revival of monotheologies globally, where there is an ending. There's a beginning and there's an ending and then there's salvation, etc. Or think about what the quantum people teach us, that there can be parallel states of superposition. Or finally, think of, we have a debate going about here about the voice, lived indigenous senses of time, an eternal cycle of repetition. Is it not the case that a democracy has to learn to live with multiple rhythms, of which progress, as you've tried to defend it, is of course hugely important, but it's not the only sense of time. It's not the only livable rhythm. And maybe we have to come to terms with that plural understanding of multiple rhythms, which I think, as it were, puts progress in its place.
Thank you. It's a very good question, but I wonder how seriously we mean it. In that, it seems to me that, and just to go back, for example, to the voice referendum, or to the way in which we try and incorporate, different views on time and so on, at the end of the day, what we do is we try and create a rights-based system, right? A justice-based system. And those systems mimic, I think, how we act as individuals, in that we want to, as I said at the beginning, project ourselves into an incremental whole in which our efforts are integrated at a particular juncture with some sense that they're not just going to be abandoned into and disappear when we're dead. And I think from a moral perspective, that is very, very important. That's what, Enlightenment philosophers, when they were discussing how philosophies of history operate, do they work in a circular way, or is there some sense of development, and how do we then track that development? It's a very important question. There is this famous essay by Kant in which he discusses what he calls a terroristic view of history, which is that history just goes back in cycles and kind of destroys itself. And he says, well, that's from a moral perspective, that viewpoint is very difficult to live with, because we need to have a sense of going on and accumulation. And accumulation doesn't mean accumulation, that's where I was trying to go with my paper, doesn't mean accumulation of the right thing, but I think it does mean accumulation of what we've learned from the wrong things. Otherwise we just lose collectively everything that we've kind of created. And culture relies on that, language relies on that, translation relies on that. So there's a number of domains of our life where we can't actually go to this piecemeal, fragmented way of understanding the self. And likewise, I think the way in which we operate in politics mirrors that, in that we try to do the same. We create constitutions and we create bodies of norm and we create justice, and of course we try to make these institutions more capacious in integrating challenges and in integrating multiple views and so on, but ultimately they all still hold on to this idea functionally that there needs to be something that is built up. And again, referendum is a very good example. Why are we even trying to give claims, and why are we trying to create institutions that are integrated with our institutions, if not because we think we ought to learn from the past, from the way in which we've done things, dominating, abusive, unilateral, non-consultative way, and yet the best thing that we've come up with is the justice system and laws and so on. So I think there is either, this is why I started by saying, as a joke, what you really mean this is in that if one takes that criticism very, very far and to its radical conclusion, it seems to me that it undermines a lot of the things that we actually build on, even when we want to incorporate those kinds of perspectives. And that's the bit that I would want to resist, I think.
Thank you. So this is an academic question, academic in the literal sense of the word, because I'm interested in the sort of scholarly connections between what you have just said and the broader scholarship against which it may be understood. Because one sort of striking thing about your presentation is that there are no names. There was just one sentence in which you listed, I think from Plato to Rawls, but 6 or 7. But then it was sort of completely depersonificated, or I don't know what would be the right verb for it, but very, very impersonal. And yet, as I've been listening to you, maybe it's sort of obsession on my part, maybe it's complete bias, but I've been hearing roles all the time. So there is, you throw things which require footnote. Justice is the first virtue of institutions. We all know, chapter 1, right? Then there are those pre-intuitive commitments, which you mentioned in the context of fascism, of course, reflective equilibrium. And then we hear this thought experiment with the counterfactual, etc., about would serfs have consented to this or not? Obviously, the original position. And I don't want it to make it too, parochial in the sense of certain intellectual sphere, but I just wonder, why wouldn't you say that openly? And then you move to one very specific issue, which you treated very, very laconically or almost cryptically, but which to me was the most interesting, because you said this would be the example, your case study about global justice, and you want to test your 3 criteria, diagnostic, innovative, and heuristic, by looking at these 2 alternative approaches, the egalitarian and sufficientarian, right? And okay, so there are immediate signposts, which I realize, okay, on the one hand, Poggi, on the other hand, Samoin, but then the question is, you sort of started something extremely interesting, but you haven't followed it up. So you only said one hint, that the sufficientarian theory is much more state-oriented, while the other one is, the egalitarian one will be much more global. And I'm asking, well, why that? I mean, maybe the other way around. I mean, they are sort of sufficientarian theories who says, what's important is that there is enough rather than there is equal distribution, may take much more global position than the egalitarian who would adopt their justice constituency within the state. So in a sense, when it started to me really to be exciting and interesting, you dropped that theme and went on. So I just would like you to respond to these 2 points. One, is it really Rawlsian sans le nom, without the name? And secondly, what is your solution? What is your answer to this sufficientarianism versus egalitarianism by reference to your criteria?
Great, thank you. So there is a way of answering the first question, which is to make my answer all about names. And basically what I'm trying, so if I were to just speak with names rather than concepts, what I'm trying to do is, yes, in some ways the account is very Rawlsian in the way it thinks about intuitions, about reflective equilibrium and so on. But it has 2 points in which it's different from Rawls. First, it's metaphysical, it's not political, insofar as it sort of starts with foundations of ethics, and so how we relate to each other and so on, whereas Rawls tried to do something different, which was almost to compartmentalize and to think about the political in a way, or at least the kind of the latter roles, so then we can get into roles in exegesis. The second point, which I think is something that Rawls doesn't think and doesn't reflect at all, and again, I can make this just about names, this is really Rawls that is Hegel plus. So Rawls is usually understood as an author that goes back to a lot of things that Hegel says, but without the philosophy of history for what Rawls thinks are good reasons, which I think take him into blind spots that to get him to extract him from. We need to give to the theory of justice a philosophy of history that is a critical philosophy of history, so not the kind of philosophy of history that people have criticized and come up with objections for. So if I were to make this just about proper names, I would say there's a part of the paper and of the theory and of the account that is very much Rawlsian, but there's a part of it that is really going much further than Rawls in that it's trying to give an account of philosophy of history, or a critical philosophy of history that backs up some of the Rawlsian claims to make the parts of Rawls that are vulnerable to criticism more robust and to make Rawlsians bite more bullets than they're willing to bite when they think about the relationship between political and metaphysical, or indeed the relationship between liberal political theory and other kinds of political theory. I think my story is much more capacious. And that's why I think I also didn't want to go too much into the sufficientarian egalitarian debate. I mean, I have a much longer version of why I think egalitarianism is a more appropriate way of diagnosing the problems of globalization when we think about the power of states and how the power of states connects to the power of markets and capital in the global world, how we think about principles of justice that are more adequate to respond to these kinds of globalized concerns and commitments. But I didn't want to, what I'm trying to do with this account of progress is to not just make it applicable to that realm of political theory disputes. I'd like it to be more methodologically, again, capacious, and to try and use the account and to use this reflection on progress to articulate also discussions that go beyond the narrow interests of this sufficientarian egalitarian controversy, which gets to the heart of a lot of issues that we actually face in the contemporary world. And so I think it's a good dispute. I didn't get to it for no, I think there was a good reason to be interested in it, but I also think there are concerns in the world that go way beyond what is captured by this debate between egalitarian and sufficientarian, and I was trying to think about how we can make the account more general and apply more generally to other concerns that one might have in the global justice debate.
Thank you, Leah. My name is Meir. I really enjoyed the talk, so thanks a lot. I have a question, and maybe it follows from my misunderstanding of some parts of the argument, but let me know what you think. So you begin by placing the argument between two extremes. We can think of progress as impossible on the one hand, with which I think I perfectly agree, and we can't also presuppose that it is necessary. And again, if I understand your argument, you go on to say it's not that we derive progress or orient progress by an ultimate normative ideal. We focus on refinement and therefore on the movements that actually drive and protests and so on. And this led me to thinking, and maybe, again, I'm mistaken, but that in a way, we will always have people claiming things, and we will always have protests. And there is no endpoint conceptually, right? Because again, we kind of dismiss the normative ideal orientation. But doesn't this mean that progress is necessary? And if progress is necessary, why wouldn't we say that?
Well, so I worry that if we say that progress is necessary, we're making predictions. If we're just talking about the kind of status of our belief, again, I think it is necessary only if one has a certain moral stance. If one doesn't have that moral stance, it's not necessary. It's only necessary if one thinks that there is a way of relating to the world that reflects on the kind of conflicts in a way that tries to derive norms of justice from them. But there is another way of reflecting on conflict, which is, not to derive norms of justice, just to exercise power and to kill people and to kind of brutalize and so on. So that is also a normative choice in a way. And I think I worry that the taking too far the claim around progress is necessary seems to remove this basic fundamental of how we engage morally with the world. I take your point that once we make that commitment, then it becomes, the story about progress is important because it becomes almost like, as I said, I started by talking about prophecy. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the more we reflect critically on progress, the more we incorporate norms of progress into how we think about institutions, the more progressive these institutions will be. But it's not necessary in that none of that is bound to remain. And I think that's where, in a way, the mistake of these teleological accounts that I was, or at least the caricature versions of these teleological accounts that I was trying to criticize, is exactly to assume that once progress has been made, because it's necessary, it's bound to stay. And I'm not sure that's the case. I think it's so dependent on human agency, and it's so dependent on the contingency of institutions that it's not automatic, and it doesn't have to stay. It's always between this not being impossible and not being necessary.
Hi, my name is Peter. Thanks for a wonderful lecture. wanted to offer a beautiful historical example that I think sort of instantiates your thesis, and then to raise a minor possible problem. So the historical example is Montesquieu on the separation of powers. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but I mean, he gets the diagnosis right by looking at Greece, at ancient Rome, and the Italian states, and of course France, and his model is England. And then he gets the heuristics right and introduces what, at least for the Federalists and the Australian Constitution, turns out to be a really, really significant innovation. Here's a potential problem. You've probably thought about this, but it struck me that your theory of political progress is predicated on the pre-existence of political failure. And, we can easily come up with Rawlsian type thought experiments where we just don't have the historical knowledge. We've got no sort of background. We're starting from ground zero, trying to build a civil society. But on your view, the only way forward is if we failed in the past.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think I have to bite the bullet. It is premised on failure, and it's premised on crisis that is insert itself in the context of failure. So it's not, and this is where I would say that the thought experiment goes too far in assuming that we start from scratch with every crisis. So I think every crisis is a result of previous institutions, previous efforts to resolve problems and so on. So I agree, it does assume continuity in history in a way, and it assumes that in there being continuity in history, there is always conflict and there's always crisis, and each crisis inserts itself in a way of reflecting and relating to other crises. If we don't make, and I think that's just, then the burden is on whoever comes up with the alternative thought experiment to show that that's not the case. I think there is always, historically, that's how it's been, and we don't know how it's going to be, but I think my account is closer to reality in assuming that that's how it works.
But can't you see the attraction of the sort of Platonic ideal, that if we do have a set of norms that can be discovered by those who've got no knowledge of history?
I think the Platonic ideal is attractive, but not because it produces ideals, because it produces a certain way of thinking about reason. And I think that's where I'm a Platonist. So I don't think there are ideals in the way in which, Plato thought about ideals literally. So I don't think, there is justice and there is the good and there is this and there is that. But I think there is something to the Platonic story, which is about the properties of reason and how we reason and how we think about valid inferences and invalid inferences, and how we even think, when Socrates says, there's ways of reflecting on justice and justification that relies on certain criteria of reason giving. On that front, yes, I am a Platonist, in that I think there is something that all humans have that they share, and that is this stance towards reason. And if you take that away, yeah, I think you take away a lot of this account. But I think a lot, as I was trying to say earlier to John, a lot is lost if you take that away. So.
Great. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to focus. We'll have thanks in a second, but I just wanted to give the thanks, actually. I just wanted to say, at the Julius Stone Institute, it's more than just a name here. It's kind of a family as well of theorists in Sydney, University of Sydney and beyond. But we're also a family in the sense that the ongoing connection with the Julius Stone's own family. So I'd like to invite Dr. Jonathan Stone up to give a note of thanks to our speaker tonight.
I'd like to take just a few minutes to do two things. One is to say something about Julius, and the other is to make a presentation to our distinguished speaker. Her eloquent talk took me back a lifetime to when Julius was rewriting his province and function of law into what he called his trilogy. 3 books which expanded that, earlier treatise, and one of which was called Human Law and Human Justice. So Professor Eppy's focus on justice obviously took me back to those days and to the many conversations I had with him, well, they weren't really conversations. I did a lot of listening. And I think he talked to me because he did a lot of his writing at home, and I was there and sentient at least. And so I got to hear. But I remember him talking about the mystery of the individual sense in the individual person of justice, where it came from. And I was impressed, in my memory anyway, by how widely he had read in search of an explanation. In the event, I spent my lifetime in neuroscience, not in the law. And in biology, and so in the study of the brain, where all the oughts come from, in the study of biological evolution, and I can tell you that there's no signal in the theory of evolution, as I understand it, of where this extraordinary sense of justice, of moral claim comes from. But it is central to what he wrote about, which was, of course, the role of the law in dealing with and managing and improving the confrontation between power and the individual sense of morality in the people being subject to that power. And that, of course, was his life's work in jurisprudence. Also, from neuroscience, there is no signal there of where the oughts come from. I can tell you this, that in the study of personality, you can ask, are there people who just don't have that property? And there are, and it's a well-recognized condition called psychopathy. And it's very chilling. About 15 years ago, the Julius Stone Institute called a meeting, a scholarly meeting, on the 100th anniversary of Julius's birth. He was very proud that he was born on the 7th day of the 7th month of the 7th year of the last century. So the conference was held, I know, on 7th of July 2007. And I was asked to give a paper, and for the research on that, I went to his archives in the National Library, and I found material, and I gave a paper. But among the things I found there were some boxes with hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts of the broadcasts he gave between 1942 and 1972 over the ABC, and they were his way of taking what understanding he had and applying it to the moral problems of those decades. Long story short, my brother and sister and I decided that they were worthy of republication. Of course, they've been published in the evanescent form of a broadcast, but now they're published in books, and I have here 2 volumes, which I would like to present to you as thanks for an elegant and distinguished talk. The books are called Letters to Australia. You won't probably have come across them, and I hope you find them of some value, and thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. I want to just thank as well Ashley, Joe, and Heather and Ken who put this event together. And lastly, of my 100 thanks tonight, thank again to our speaker, Leah.